I stared at the ceiling that night, eyes wide open in the dark, my breath shallow and my pulse an unsteady metronome echoing in my ears. The room smelled faintly of the lavender detergent Diana used for our sheets, but it didn't soothe me. I could feel the soft fabric against my skin, the gentle warmth of the comforter. Yet my thoughts were anything but gentle. They circled around one point, slow and deliberate, like a hawk scanning the field below. Hours earlier, my son had toddled into the living room, tears dribbling down his cheeks, clutching the broken remains of a small toy car. That car had been promised to him, according to his own anxious words, by someone he called Uncle Steve. It was an innocent remark, but it cut through me. I asked, "Who's Uncle Steve?" And my boy just sniffled and blinked, the name evidently meaning more to him than it did to me. I glanced at Diana, searching for answers, but her expression froze. Something flickered there. Guilt, surprise, or fear. I couldn't tell which, only that it unsettled her. She recovered quickly, said something vague about a friend from her gym who had once jokingly offered to get our kid a nicer version of that toy if it ever broke. But the pit in my stomach knew better. My mind latched onto that single detail and wouldn't let it go. Now, lying in bed, I replayed the way Diana's face went rigid for that fraction of a second. She rarely slipped. She usually managed her expressions well. But that night, she was off her game. So was I, in a different sense. I felt the edges of my composure fray as I tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was all a silly misunderstanding. Maybe I was being paranoid. Then again, maybe not. My mind replayed subtle changes in her behavior these last few months. Extra time at the gym, an odd bright flush on her cheeks when she came home, and a few too many text messages she quickly swiped away whenever I glanced over. I told myself I was imagining things, but in that moment, at 3 in the morning, sleep nowhere in sight, the only person I was fooling was me. I turned my head to see her back, a faint silhouette in the darkness, long hair draped across the pillow. She was breathing slowly, too slowly, as though she were awake but pretending otherwise. I said nothing. I let her keep her secrets. I inhaled once, exhaled, and gazed back at that featureless ceiling. I might have been losing my mind, but I wasn't about to confront her. No, not yet. Not without proof. What came next was a kind of numb clarity. I decided I would hold onto my composure, no matter how sharp the blades of suspicion got. Instead of bursting out with accusations, I would do what I do best: observe, research, and act quietly. Because if there's anything that unsettles a liar more than shouting, it's unspoken certainty. The next day, I went about my work as though everything were normal. I'm a copywriter by trade, occasionally helping clients with their digital marketing strategies. That morning, my mind wasn't on the web content I was supposed to craft. It was on my plan. After I wrapped up a quick Zoom meeting, I checked my phone to find that Diana had texted me about groceries. A completely routine message, but the sight of her name on my screen made my chest tighten. The rest of the day, I stuck to my vow. I didn't question her, didn't ask about Uncle Steve, didn't so much as raise an eyebrow. I even offered to pick up our son from preschool, though typically she did that. She hesitated, then agreed. In the background, I sensed her relief that I wasn't pushing for answers. But that evening, while Diana showered, I scanned her phone. It was locked, of course, but the notification screen showed a missed call from S. My stomach clenched. I swiped away the image of that letter on the phone's display, that single initial that might as well have spelled out betrayal. I said nothing at dinner. I watched my boy push peas around on his plate and mention Uncle Steve in passing again. I pretended not to notice how Diana's posture stiffened, how her eyes flicked to me as though bracing for confrontation. All she got from me was a neutral nod. By the time we tucked in our son and said our routine goodnights, I realized I felt strangely calm. A part of me was hurting, a deeper part than I had ever known, but it was sealed behind a frosty shell. Diana kissed me on the cheek, light, formal, almost like we were acquaintances. I gave her a small smile. She vanished into the bathroom to brush her teeth. The next few days were more of the same. She went to the gym, lingered there. I found extra charges on her credit card for midday coffee runs in parts of town she rarely visited before. And all the while, I was outwardly the same old me, a father, a man devoted to his freelance projects, meticulously silent. It was on a Tuesday that I got the actual name, Steve Harris. I recognized the last name from a passing conversation with Diana's friend, who once lauded the new fitness instructor at the gym. Tall, great smile, the best trainer in town, she'd said. When my son had first dropped his toy car, he'd repeated the name, Uncle Steve, the way little kids do, sounding so certain of its significance. That was the day I placed an order for a DNA test kit. My hand shook slightly as I filled out the form online. I hated myself for even suspecting that my boy might not be mine. But the doubt was gnawing at me, refusing to be silenced. That doubt, maybe it was born of paranoia, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. I carried that secret with me, like a bruise no one else could see. And at the same time, I began drafting a letter, a real letter, on actual paper. I typed it first, revising and rewriting. Then I handwrote it, copying each word carefully in my neat, rounded script. It was a letter I intended to leave behind if anything ever happened to me, if the stress overcame me or if fate intervened. Diana, I wrote, you've taken a part of me I can never recover. I don't hate you. Hate would be too simple. I only regret I wasn't enough for you. This is the truth about how I felt, about how I suspected you but never confronted you until I had all the pieces in place. I'm not a hero. I'm a crack in the foundation. I'm a flaw you never wanted to see. But I'm still here, and I will do what I must. I continued in that vein, pouring out my hurt, my sense of betrayal, and yet my refusal to lash out blindly. Then I sealed the letter in a plain white envelope, wrote her name on the front, and hid it in my study's bottom drawer beneath old tax documents. It was a testament, a confession of heartbreak I would never share with her unless I was gone. Or maybe, in some twisted logic, I half hoped she'd find it and realize I wasn't the fool she believed me to be. After that, I made a show of joining the same gym. I even told Diana I wanted to get in better shape, maybe lose a few pounds, strengthen my back. She reacted with a curious mixture of enthusiasm and anxiety. Her eyes flickered with concern, but she tried to mask it, telling me how great the place was, how I'd love the facilities. The first time I stepped into that gym, the smell of rubber mats and disinfectant assaulted my senses. I passed by a row of treadmills, elliptical machines, weight benches, and a mirrored wall reflecting row after row of focused patrons. Then I spotted him. He was tall, athletic, tanned, with that confident posture that announces to the world he's the alpha in the room. He wore a tight-fitting black t-shirt with the gym's logo on the left side of his chest, matching track pants, and a pair of pristine sneakers. I recognized him from a photo on the gym's website. Steve Harris, personal trainer extraordinaire. He flashed a brilliant smile at me as I walked past, the same smile I'd seen in that digital photo. White teeth, a slight cleft in his chin. I nodded politely, my jaw clenched so hard I half expected to hear my molars crack. Diana was nowhere in sight that first day. I did a light workout, focusing on elliptical and some stretching. Then I showered quickly in the men's locker room and left, but not before pausing at the front desk. Steve stood there, chatting with a coworker, and I let my gaze linger on him. He was oblivious to the intensity of my stare. Over the next few weeks, I acclimated to the gym, gradually building a rapport with some of the staff. I never once hinted that I was suspicious or that my wife might have a connection there. I was simply a new member looking to improve my health. Eventually, my quiet observation paid off. I saw Steve and Diana together in the corner near the free weights area, standing too close. Her hand was on his forearm while he spoke, and the way she looked at him spoke volumes. It wasn't the friendly banter you have with a trainer. It was intimate. A softness in her gaze, a slight parting of her lips. I pretended not to see them, walking to the far side of the gym to do some leg presses. My chest felt hollow, but my expression remained unchanging. That night, another long, sleepless stretch. Diana fell asleep before me, or at least she pretended to. I stared at the ceiling again, counting the cracks and lumps in the paint. My mind drifted, imagining the worst, wrestling with that bitter question. Did she love him? Or was he just an escape from me, from our marriage? Did she laugh with him, tell him her fears and hopes? Days later, I finally got my hands on the DNA kit. I gathered my own sample, then discreetly collected a swab from my son, turning the process into a silly game. Open wide, buddy, let Dad count your teeth. My hands shook the entire time, adrenaline surging. Then I packaged the samples and sent them off. The wait would be excruciating, but I kept my mask of calm. The day I sent off the kit, I saw them again at the gym. This time, I lingered in the hallway near the trainer's office, out of sight but within earshot. I heard their voices, hushed but distinct. Steve's deeper tones, Diana's softer ones. Words like tomorrow and wait for me. Then a rustle, followed by a muffled gasp. I peeked around the corner, not even sure if I truly wanted to see. She was pressed against the wall, his body leaning into hers. Her eyes were closed, hands sliding along his arms. He leaned down, murmuring something against her ear before covering her mouth with his. She let out a soft moan, a sound that stung my ears like acid. My entire frame stiffened, and for a half-second I considered stepping forward, either to break them apart or to do something unthinkable. But then I remembered my promise to myself. No explosions, no outbursts. I forced myself to step back, quietly, so they wouldn't hear. That moment was an agony that seared my heart, but I swallowed it. My pulse hammered in my throat. I clenched my hands into fists and counted my breaths, moving away from that scene of betrayal one measured step at a time. It was so deliberate, so wrong, so undeniably real. Any lingering doubts were gone. This wasn't just a flirtation. Diana was lost in that moment with Steve, completely wrapped up in him. The rawness of that knowledge shredded my insides, and yet a part of me felt almost relieved. I had the confirmation I needed. The lies were now fully exposed. I left the gym early that day, claiming I felt under the weather. At home, I busied myself with mindless chores, folding laundry, cleaning out the fridge, anything to keep my hands from shaking. When Diana came home, she had that post-workout glow. She tried to kiss my cheek, but I turned slightly, letting her lips barely brush my skin. She pretended not to notice. We went about our usual evening routine: dinner, bath time for our son, a bedtime story. My boy laughed at the silly voices I made, oblivious to the tension coiling in the atmosphere. I lingered in his bedroom, watching him drift off to sleep, wishing life could be as simple as his world of colorful toys and bedtime tales. Once I was certain he was asleep, I walked into the living room. Diana was on the couch, flipping through TV channels. My gaze rested on her, taking in the curve of her shoulders, the anxious way she held the remote. I remembered that moment in the hallway of the gym, the press of Steve's body against hers, the willingness in her posture. My wife, my partner, my betrayer. I cleared my throat, but the words that wanted to spill out, accusations, demands, a roar of pain, remained lodged behind my calm mask. Instead, I said, "I'm going to bed early," my voice steady, almost gentle. She nodded, a bit surprised, but didn't protest. Late that night, staring at the ceiling yet again, I wondered if I should just file for divorce, cut the cord. But a colder logic slid into my thoughts. If she was willing to lie so thoroughly, maybe she deserved something more than a clean break. Maybe she needed to see what it felt like when the ground beneath her feet crumbled. That idea both frightened and invigorated me. Over the next few weeks, I took subtle steps. I befriended Steve's wife, or rather, his ex-wife. It turned out they were separated but not fully divorced. She was still around, seeking closure or perhaps trying to salvage something. Her name was Rachel. I found her number through an online search that connected her last name to a local address. I called, introduced myself under the pretense of having questions about the gym memberships and personal training. We met in a small cafe one afternoon. She was guarded at first, a slender woman, early 30s, carrying a quiet pain in her eyes. When I gently probed about Steve, her expression darkened. She told me how he'd always been restless, always looking for the next thrill. She suspected there was someone new. I nodded, sipping my coffee, letting her see the reflection of my own heartbreak. After a time, I let a few details slip, just enough for her to guess that the someone new might be my wife. I didn't accuse. I merely let the evidence speak. A text message timestamp, a suspicious receipt from a coffee shop, their casual closeness at the gym. She listened, hands trembling around her paper cup. She seemed both anguished and vindicated. Her suspicions had been right. That was when I showed her the envelope, the letter I'd written to Diana, though I didn't open it. I explained, I wrote this because I needed to put my feelings somewhere, but it's addressed to my wife, in case something happens to me. Rachel's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She breathed out, "He always denies it. Always has some story." She stared at my envelope for a moment, then back up at me. "But I believe you." We sat in heavy silence for a moment. She confessed that she still had keys to the apartment she and Steve used to share. She could retrieve some of his personal items, maybe find further proof of his involvement with my wife. I nodded but told her not to do anything yet. I had a plan. I just needed her to trust me. In the following days, I learned that my DNA test results were delayed. Another round of waiting. Meanwhile, I kept going to the gym, feigning progress in my workouts. I would see them occasionally, not always together, but often enough. The staff knew me by name now. Steve gave me a friendly nod when we crossed paths, like we were just two guys dedicated to fitness. I reciprocated with a polite smile, feeling that slow burn in my chest every time I looked at him. Diana stayed distant at home. She offered fewer excuses about her whereabouts, perhaps thinking I was too preoccupied to notice, or maybe she believed I was clueless. Sometimes, late at night, she'd start, "Honey, do you?" But then she'd see the look on my face and stop. She was balancing on a razor's edge, probably thinking I might suspect something, but not sure how much I knew. My own emotional state was precarious. I was calm, yes, but it was the calm of a man who decided to be a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. I wrote more letters to Diana, rewriting the original, refining my words. I placed them in the same envelope and tucked them deeper into my drawer. Even if no one else ever saw those letters, they reminded me of my purpose. I was not a hero, only a man with a wound that refused to heal. Eventually, the test results arrived. My heart. "I'm not looking for pity." I told her my plan, to let Steve and Diana's guilt tear them apart from the inside, without me lifting a finger in anger. I wanted to apply subtle pressure, enough that they'd start to question each other, cast blame, self-destruct. Rachel listened closely, nodding. The first step was a carefully orchestrated moment in which Rachel confronted Steve at the gym about suspicious phone calls, while I made sure Diana overheard. I happened to be doing squats near the open door to the office. Diana was on the treadmill, a short distance away. She heard Rachel's raised voice, though she couldn't catch every word. The tension was thick. Steve's voice was low, defensive, as though he was denying everything. Rachel stormed out, nearly bumping into Diana on her way to the locker room. Diana paused mid-jog, eyebrows knitted. She looked over at Steve, who now stood with fists clenched, face pale. I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Was he telling her the truth about the status of his marriage? About the possibility of other affairs? That evening, Diana was rattled. She tried to talk to me at dinner, stumbling over some half-truths about gym drama. I listened quietly, giving only non-committal hums. She seemed almost desperate for me to say something, but I kept my composure. Finally, she trailed off, biting her lip. Her eyes darted around the room. She looked so alone in that moment, but I couldn't muster pity. In the following days, the tension rose. Steve's ex-wife continued to reach out to him, pressing him for an explanation, while I casually maintained contact with Rachel to ensure we were on the same page. She told me that Steve had grown paranoid, suspecting she had an ally feeding her information. At home, Diana withdrew further. I noticed her phone buzzing more often, and once or twice, I caught her whispering into it with tears brimming in her eyes. She wasn't the only one unraveling. Steve showed up at the gym with a grim expression, snapping at coworkers, rummaging through his phone like it contained secrets he couldn't decode. One day, Rachel came by my place again. She told me she'd found an old note of Steve's that confirmed he was juggling multiple flings, even before Diana. With a heavy sigh, I stared at that piece of paper. It was some half-baked message about meeting the new one at a bar, referencing times and places that didn't match Diana's. I guessed that once a liar finds success, it gets easier to expand the web. I took the note and slid it into the same drawer as my letter. Then I told Rachel, "We're almost there. Just a few more pushes." She didn't ask me to clarify. It was all unspoken. Steve was a malignant presence, hurting people in his orbit. He needed to be exposed, shattered from within. That weekend, I convinced Diana to go to a couples gathering at the gym, a small social event the management had arranged to foster a sense of community. She seemed uneasy, but she agreed. Steve was there, of course, and I caught the flicker of panic in his face when he spotted us. I gave him a curt nod. Through the evening, we mingled with other gym members, sipping on protein shakes and nibbling fruit platters. Diana stuck close to me, her eyes darting around, half expecting something to blow up at any moment. And sure enough, it did, but not the way she imagined. Rachel arrived uninvited, walking in with a determined stride. She found Steve and confronted him in front of everyone. Her voice was steady, loud enough that the hush fell over the crowd. "Stop denying everything. I have the proof. All of it." Steve stammered, his words a tangle of denials and half-hearted retorts. Diana watched, her face draining of color. Meanwhile, I stood back, arms crossed, observing. My heart hammered, but my expression was as cold and impassive as a winter sky. I saw guilt contort Diana's features. She turned to me, opened her mouth, but no sound came. In front of everyone, Rachel held up a small folder of printed messages, hotel receipts, and screenshots. She didn't name my wife specifically, but the implication was clear. Steve had lied to multiple women, painted himself as single or separated, and manipulated each for his own pleasure. Diana's eyes brimmed with tears. She looked at me with something that might have been shame, or perhaps a frantic appeal for help. I just gazed back, offering no rescue, no words, simply letting her see my unspoken knowledge. Then, swiftly, she turned on her heel and left. The tension in that room was suffocating. Steve tried to follow Diana, but Rachel blocked his path, tossing the folder onto the floor at his feet. A few people stepped back, watching the spectacle with wide eyes. Then Steve snapped. He yelled something at Rachel, voice raw with anger. She hurled an insult back at him. The manager and some staff hurried over to break it up before it got physical. I slipped out in the confusion, calm steps carrying me to the exit. Outside, the cool night air felt like a slap after the stuffy gym interior. Diana was standing by our car, arms wrapped around herself. The streetlights revealed the anguish on her face. I walked up, stood beside her without a word. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "I'm sorry." I stared at the pavement, swirling with the reflection of the street lamp. "Are you?" I asked quietly, voice neutral. She shuddered. I never meant to hurt you. I was lonely, and he. Don't, I interrupted. Don't do that. Don't make excuses. She pressed her lips together. I could feel her need to unload everything, to beg for forgiveness or find some explanation. But I wouldn't let her. Finally, we drove home in silence. She offered to stay at a hotel or with a friend, but I told her I wanted to keep things normal for our son's sake, at least until we figured out a plan. She didn't argue. Over the next few days, word spread through the gym community. People whispered about Steve's meltdown, about Rachel's reveal, about the faint traces of drama. Diana probably heard more of it than I did, but I didn't bother asking for details. Then, one morning, she found my envelope. I'm not sure how. Maybe she was looking for something in my desk or stumbling around out of morbid curiosity. I walked into my study and found her sitting there, envelope in hand, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. I stood in the doorway, arms folded, while she turned the pages of my handwritten letters. She read lines that detailed my heartbreak, my rage, my plan. She looked up at me, tears shining. This is everything you felt," she said in a trembling voice. "Yes." She set the letter on the desk, carefully, like it might burn her. "You never said a word to me. You never fought back. You just let me." I let the silence drag out, pressing her. Finally, she whispered, "I want to come back. I want to fix this." I looked away, my jaw tightening. "Too late," I murmured. She sobbed quietly, clenching the letter in her hands until it crumpled. "But what about our son?" "I'm still his father," I said. "That doesn't change. But I'm done with whatever this was between us." I stepped closer, took the letter from her trembling grip, and smoothed its creases. Then I walked out, leaving her alone in my study. In the hallway, I heard her muffled sobs. They tugged at something inside me, but I didn't turn back. In the days that followed, I began the slow process of disentangling our lives. I consulted a lawyer, though I kept that from her for the time being. She withdrew from the gym, presumably out of humiliation, while Steve lost clients daily. The rumor mill churned, and couples who used to idolize him as a charismatic trainer started avoiding him. Some asking for refunds or switching to new instructors. Rachel called me to say she was finally taking steps to finalize the divorce, grateful that the truth was out. She said Steve tried to lie and twist her words, but she refused to believe him anymore. "He can't even look me in the eye," she said softly over the phone. "I guess your plan worked." My plan. I had no illusions that it was some grand scheme of genius, just a gradual tightening of threads that forced them all to face the consequences of their own actions. Diana, for her part, still lived under the same roof for the moment, in a separate bedroom, but we rarely spoke. There were times, late at night, when I'd pass her door and hear her muffled weeping. I wouldn't let myself feel sorry for her. Instead, I returned to my own bed, stared at that same ceiling. Only now, there was a certain grim satisfaction in my chest. Not joy, not relief, but a sense that the world was set right. People in our city started whispering. A scandal like this travels fast. Diana tried to maintain her dignity at work, but the rumor eventually reached a couple of her colleagues, who recognized Steve from the gym. Our neighbors gave me strange looks. Some pitied me, others avoided me, uncertain how to address it. I carried on. I wrote up a new marketing campaign for one of my biggest clients, took my son to the park on weekends, answered the phone when my father in Florida called for our monthly catch-up. I never offered him the details of my crumbling marriage. I just told him we were working through some issues. Then one afternoon, I was leaving the grocery store when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unfamiliar number. The message read, "He denies everything, but I believe you." "I'm sorry this happened." It was Rachel. I realized Steve had apparently tried to worm his way out, painting me as a jealous or unstable husband, but she wasn't buying it. I didn't respond. I simply tucked my phone back into my pocket, loaded the groceries into the trunk, and drove home, letting that quiet sense of resolution fill me. Over time, I came to see that Diana wanted to salvage what was left. She tiptoed around me, occasionally offering small gestures of appeasement, making my favorite dinner, cleaning my study, sending me texts like, "Hope you're doing okay." But there was a hollowness to her attempts, and I'd already made my decision. There was no going back. The day finally arrived when I told her she should move out. Our son was at preschool, so it was just the two of us, standing in the hallway. She looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I don't have any right to beg you," she whispered. "But I truly am sorry." "You should be," I said, my tone devoid of anger. That calm was terrifying even to me. She blinked, tears brimming, and slowly nodded. In the weeks that followed, she found a small apartment, packed her things with a quiet sense of loss. I let her stay long enough to arrange it properly for the sake of our son. I gave her no grief, no harsh words. Perhaps the absence of visible fury hurt more than if I'd screamed at her. Eventually, she left. My house felt emptier, but also strangely lighter. Friends asked me if I was okay, if I needed company. I mostly preferred my own space. There was a certain solace in solitude, in knowing I had walked through fire and come out the other side. Scared, yes, but not destroyed. Word around town was that Steve tried to rebuild his reputation, but it wasn't going well. He'd lost respect, clients, and whatever illusions he'd carried about being untouchable. Meanwhile, I found myself with a bizarre local notoriety. People whispered, "Did you hear what he did? How he just calmly exposed it all." They called me the legend, though I never felt legendary. Diana became a footnote in those whispered tales, a cautionary mention of how a moment of weakness can unravel a life. I didn't revel in it, but I didn't deny it either. I just carried on, focusing on my son, my work, my own bruised soul. Late at night, sometimes I still stare at the ceiling, alone in that king-sized bed. I think about the fracture lines in my marriage, the slow, chilling way I discovered the truth. I remember that scorching moment at the gym when I saw Diana kissing Steve, how I wanted to scream, to hit something, to break every bone in his body. But I didn't. I was the scalpel, not the hammer. And that was far more frightening to them, in the end, because I knew everything, and I never exploded. I just cut with icy precision, one measured stroke at a time, until they tore each other apart. The guilt I carried wasn't truly mine. It was a distorted sense of failure for not preventing this, for letting her slip away. But I've learned to live with it, to bear it like a scar that doesn't define me. In the quiet of these nights, I let that numbness wash over me. I'm not a hero. I'm a crack. And I can live with that. Sometimes I recall her words, "I never meant to hurt you." Maybe she didn't, but she did, all the same. Maybe that's the final lesson of betrayal. Intentions don't absolve the damage. And once the trust is gone, it's gone for good. I don't cry. I'm not sure if it's pride, or if I've just burned out that part of me. Men aren't supposed to cry, they say. Perhaps that's a myth, but it's one I can't shake. Regardless, the tears never come. The pain is there, like a dull ache that emerges when it rains. But life goes on. Diana hovers in the periphery of my life now, a whisper in the corridors of my memory. Steve exists somewhere in the same city, avoiding my gaze whenever our paths might cross. Their story is old news to the general public, replaced by fresh gossip and small-town dramas. But when people see me in the grocery store or at my son's school events, I notice the respectful nods. It's as if they're acknowledging the man who was tested by betrayal and didn't break. I don't care much for that spotlight. I only care that I did what needed to be done, in my own way. My boy is happy, a bright spark who loves his father without reservation. That knowledge sustains me. In the end, my revenge was never about blood or violence. It was about letting the truth destroy the lies. Now, on the nights when insomnia strikes, I no longer stare at the ceiling in torment. I observe it like an old friend, the same blank expanse, that once held my anxieties. Now it's just there, silent, unchanged, like the moon or the stars, and I realize, with a certain grim satisfaction, that nothing has to break me unless I allow it. That's how I became a legend in this place, by refusing to play the fool, and by refusing to tear the world apart with rage. Instead, I let my silence speak, my knowledge sharpen into a scalpel, and when it was over, they were the ones left cowering, unable to look me in the eye. She tried to come back, but I was gone, out of reach. I am the echo in their heads, a quiet, persistent reminder that actions have consequences. The city whispers about me in hushed voices, how I simply stood there, calm as ice, while their affair unraveled. Yes, I'm the legend in that story. She's just the footnote. And that, in the end, is all that remains.